Hello, Earthlings, and welcome back to Earth Day 2021. My name is Matt Tranchen. I serve as the president of March for Science, and I am joined by my friend and compatriot, Hita Lakhani, Global South focal point for Youngo. Hita, how are you, my friend?
Doing great, Matt. Super excited for everything that we have going on today.
Oh, most definitely, and super excited for this next guest. Would you kindly introduce our friend to the world?
Absolutely. Today I have a very special guest here with us today, a dear friend of mine from Sudan, Nisreen Elsaim. She's a member of the Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group. She chairs the Youth Advisory Group, but in addition to that, she's also part of the African Group of Negotiators, where she negotiates as a youth negotiator for Sudan, and she's part of the Sudanese Youth Organization on Climate Change. Nisreen, welcome.
Thank you very much, Hita and Matt. I'm very glad to be here and happy Earth Day to everyone.
Happy Earth Day indeed. Well, Nisreen, let's jump right into it. At the end of last year, the Youth Advisory Group issued a report with several calls to action that really highlighted the perspectives of youth from around the world that participated in what you all really helped facilitate, which was mobilizing young organizations, youth leaders to come together and inform what recommendations would be given to the Secretary General to help inform his climate action. What would you like people who are tuning in now to take away from what was in that report?
Well, Matt, the report was just a way of telling everyone that young people are here and we are not only here, but we have a very good responses, very good ideas, and very good action points and recommendations to different issues that we are facing right now to restore the environment and restore the planet. The report was a way of saying to other young people also that we are not only thinking outside the box, but we completely forget that there is a box. And to ensure that, first of all, and our first priority is the planet and having a future for the next generations. Well, the report was also a call to remember that we must and we can, it's actually possible to live in a synergy and in a homogeneous situation and in equilibrium with the nature as we used to be before the climate change time and before what's happening right now. The report was also a gathering of different ideas, thoughts, the butter of more than 150 participants from around the world who participated in the consultations, in their views, their experiences, their lessons learned, but the most important, their good practices that they succeeded with in their own communities. Also, the report was a call for more coordination between young people around the world and policymakers and decision makers inside of their countries, but also in the international community. Well, I argue everyone and urge them to actually have a look on it, but also challenge the report and take it forward because it's only the first step in our actions toward like our different jobs and mandate as a youth advisory group.
You know, and Nisreen, that's really the shift we've seen in the last, couple years is moving from young people around the world publicly demonstrating, mobilizing, organizing, to actually having an opportunity to have a seat at the table and be listened to and have those ideas actually inform policy. Of course, as part of the Youth Advisory Group for the Secretary General, you're one of 7 youth leaders who are doing that at the highest level. Are you encouraged by what you're seeing with governments around the world and the extent to which young people are brought into those decision-making processes?
Well, I guess to some extent, as you mentioned, UN is doing by far better work in bringing young people into the table than different governments and different officials around the world. I think politics is still a very much game of older generation. Let me mention that. And I have a very live evidence in different countries, specifically Sudan, where we had a revolution all led by young people. But then when we come to the senior positions, the ministers, the decision makers positions, and so on, they are all the previous generation. But the most important thing here is we are not in intergenerational fight or war, let me say. Yes, there is a gap between the previous generation and our generation, but this is not the main problem. The main problem happens where we actually bridge this gap and we find rejection from the other side. And this is something we are not witnessing right now, yet we are uh, forecasting that at some point we will have to reach this point. I will give another small example. In Tunisia, for example, they used to have a quota for females in the parliament, and then they did a huge advocacy for having much females in the parliament, to the point where the quota actually became a handicap for women participation in the parliament. So this is something we really should forecast in our youth, a movement to where having a seat in the table will never be enough for us.
Absolutely, Nisreen. And I think this is something very valuable, right? Like as youth, we have been championing so many things. We've been asking for our leaders to do their job, firstly. Secondly, asking for youth as a seat at the table. But we're realizing there is still something lacking despite everything that is done. And how do you think we can work towards bridging this gap collectively?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of people doesn't really see how important it is to have information flow system between the previous generations. For example, in many cases where we see experts working with other experts, but they have the perception that young people are not really willing to listen and learn, which is something not true. I think breaking up the perceptions that other generations and other stakeholders have about young people is something we somehow succeeded in doing. Now the whole world knows that we are not only a gang of teenagers or young people with a huge energy that they don't know what to do with it. Now they know that we are able actually to drive our energy to a very much constructive way and to build a better future for us. Yet we have to have formal mechanisms of flowing information from the previous generation to the new generation. Mentorships program, fellowships program, any mechanism that enable young people to actually learn and work closely with the older generation, with the experts that we have, will limit this gap and bridge it somehow.
Now, Nisreen, for folks tuning in, just as background, you are an activist, you are a scientist, you are a international climate change negotiator, and so you really have quite a comprehensive viewpoint that puts you in a unique position of understanding what is happening outside the walls of these negotiations, but also intimately understands, I think, that the frustration many people feel about why progress isn't being achieved as quickly as necessary. I want to begin with just a healthy dose of reality, and then I promise we're going to end this on a hopeful note. But let's talk about the state of the climate crisis. Of course, the NDC synthesis report, this is the nationally determined contributions, those goals that were established by every country in the wake of the Paris Agreement, those pledges to make their contribution to address the climate crisis are woefully inadequate, right? The goal that was set was to try and keep global warming below 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. And the trajectory we're on looks like it's going to far exceed that. There was a report that was recently issued, was it yesterday that came out? What can you talk about that report and what its conclusions were?
Thank you very much, Matt. Well, yes. Well, being a scientist, or I can't claim being a scientist, I can claim with a person with a science background. I mean, saying a scientist is a big thing, but as a person with a science background, yes, the reports are not very much promising. And unfortunately, all of them says that we are not only doing things as usual or business as usual, we're actually doing business as extra usual. The trajectory, as you mentioned, is actually going to 4.3 at some scenarios, and other scenarios is going to 3.8 by 2030. Some scenarios says by 2040, and then the last scenario says by 2050. But all of the scenarios are not really promising, and they don't mention at any meaningful way that we are actually going to stop at 2 degrees, not even talking about 1.5 degrees. This is a different issue. In Africa specifically, because Africa is a great mass, when we are normally zero point 0.2 or 0.3 warmer than the other continents, and when it's 1.2 or 1.1 right now, it's almost 1.4. Some areas it's 1.3 in Africa already.
Right.
So if we are talking about 1.5, we are just this close from reaching 1.5 itself. The World Climate Report issued by the World Meteorological Organization is also, yeah, it was launched 3 days ago, and it's not also promising. Well, while they say in the report in more than once in one place that there is still a way of reaching that, the way is, for me as a person with a negotiating background also, I see it's very dreamy for decision makers and policy makers. For us, it's not dreamy, of course, because this is the right thing to do, and we should go radical to save the planet and the future generation. But for the decision makers, for the world leaders, they count economy, they count wealth, they count a lot of other things. So I'm not sure if it's possible for them to actually, to actually stop at the level that mentioned in the report.
And I'll just, Nisreen, on that point, and then I'd love Hida to jump in. But, oftentimes when people talk about the climate crisis, there's a focus on climate mitigation, right? How do we do all part to transition to renewable energy and slow down as the world is seemingly headed off a cliff? But in reality, the other side of that coin is climate adaptation. Recognizing the situation we're in and doing what's required to ensure that we strengthen the resilience of communities in the face of global warming and the changes that will come with it. Have you seen a renewed urgency as an international climate change negotiator to put more of an emphasis on securing the resources for those frontlines communities that are desperately in need of the support to address climate adaptation?
Yes, well, in order, of course, to stay below 2 degrees or 1.5, we need to do huge mitigation part. Yet, developing countries, least developed countries, and vulnerable communities to climate change are already suffering. I mean, we are not in a normal condition. We are already in a global warming. So, of course, global climate crises will happen. And of course, things are not the same or not as usual as it was before the global warming. So, yeah, we are trying to stay below 1.5 or below 2 degrees, which requires mitigation, but also we are not in the equilibrium level. We are not in the zero level right now. So, of course, we need adaptation. You talked about NDCs. Well, for African continent, at least, because this is the continent I have a lot of documents about.
Right.
I know that they documented more than 50 NDCs for the Paris Agreement, and now they are updating them. But only 2 African countries managed to actually implement parts of their NDCs. So for now, NDCs is just an empty term, an empty document for a lot of African continent because no one implemented anything. Climate finance is always a big topic in the negotiation, in the side events, and so on. The only issue we have, right, it's not the only, but the biggest issue is we don't even have a definition for climate finance. No one actually knows what is climate finance. And even the climate finance we have right now, only 25% or less goes to adaptation, while more than 75% goes to mitigation, which is something unfair.
Yeah, absolutely, Nisreen. I think you brought up such valid facts and points, when things that we do need to think about. As we're on this topic about countries and ambition and NDCs, coming from the global south, like myself, I have seen my country negotiators, and the stance of India in general is that the developed countries should do more. While I do agree to that, um, do you think that sort of narrative, which is continuous since the past 25 years in the UNFCCC, where the developed countries should take the onus, which is, while I do agree with it, do you think that's the only narrative we should be continuing with? Um, or do you think it is time for bigger developing countries, India, Brazil, Russia, China, to step up their game and actually say, become leaders of the global south and say, we're going to take action? What is your worldview? And coming also from a fellow developing country, what do you think about this?
Well, Hita, a very good mentor of mine always says the following: if someone borrowed money from you and then you requested your money back, and then this someone did not give you your money back, then that doesn't mean that it's not your right to claim your money just because he did not or she did not give it to you. Well, historical responsibility is there, whether they acknowledged it or no, and we will not stop claiming historical responsibility just because they decided to give a side on it or just walk away from it. Rights are rights, and this takes us into a very important point, which is right-based approach to climate change. Um, Here we are not even negotiating the historical responsibility, because the whole convention on climate change, the first convention, was all built on a very important principle, which is historical responsibility. Now, any other document or any other agreement, the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement or anything, is not a separate document. It's built on the spirit, on the basis, on the principles of the Convention of Climate Change. And the Convention clearly built on the historical responsibility. So this is something not even negotiable. The 25 years, I think it took them too long because a lot of people were not um, convinced with the concept of climate change in the first place, not even mentioning paying for that or lowering their emission for that. I think this time has passed now, and I think what we achieved in 25 years should now be able to be achieved in less than 5 years, because we are in the speed century. I mean, things should move speedily. The second thing is the civil society was somehow detached from what's happening in the negotiation, which is also not the case now. Now the civil society pushes the government, even if they decided to be denials, to accept and to do actions regarding climate change. So now we have by far more factors, more players in the ground than we had in the past 25 years. And young people, of course, along with the civil society movement, is a very strong players that we did not have in the past days.
And Nisreen, to build on this optimism, even in the last 5 years since the Paris agreements, there's been an enormous change in the financial markets surrounding clean energy. I think whereas when the Paris Agreement was first established, it wasn't always as financially viable to make this transition. We now find ourselves in a situation where it's not just the right thing to do on a moral basis. It's the financially smart thing to do to transition to clean, reliable, resilient energy infrastructure. Are you seeing that play out in negotiations where countries are more bullish and more ambitious not because it is something that they all of a sudden feel compelled to do, but because they're recognizing the enormous financial opportunity within it?
Yes and no. This
Okay.
is a huge trap because in the negotiation, for example, the private sector, so actually the general sector, which is the government, is always trying to throw the ball into the private sector's field, for example. And then it says, well, it's not. They are trying always to put the private sector in the front line because they think that businesses can handle this. And this is not very much true because every business is obliged by the regulations of the country. So if the country have the actual political will and the right regulations, then the businesses cannot move further or beyond what's mentioned in the law. Otherwise, it will be a very big case. Also, this activism, I think I will be very much honest, it's by far more propaganda or a media thing than it is an actual willing to change. There is a lot of good steps, I acknowledge it, of course, but is it enough? This is the question that we should always ask ourselves. Because even if we did some effort and if it wasn't enough, then so at some point it will be pointless. We have a deadline, we have a red line also, and the deadline is very soon, and the red line is the 2 degrees or the 1.5 degrees. So we should just stop being very much loose and try to talk about time frames, about targets, about indicators. I mean, I'm very grateful for President Biden because he's the first one actually to set a target when he mentioned that U.S. will be back to the Paris Agreement in 77 days, which was the first world leader to set a target with a time frame. And it was very pleasant because we, as a civil society, as a negotiator, as a climate advocate, we could actually count days and say, well, you have 4 days left, you have 3 days left, and then before the 77 day, they will be really back to the Paris Agreement. So this is a very good thing. I think a lot of world leaders should do the same, where they bound their promises with time frames and with indicators, so we can actually track it and hold them into account.
Are you you're encouraging world leaders to establish timelines to hold themselves accountable? What a concept! I love that. Look, you mentioned political will, and the United States and the Biden administration. It's worth noting that we just had an election last November. It was extremely close, and ultimately, one of the major factors that helped elect President Biden was youth. It was young people getting involved, getting engaged, and you're seeing that really around the world. Engagement is at an all-time high, and the strategies being used to educate peers, empower peers, get people more involved with the use of technology. I think the innovation that's taken place in the midst of a pandemic, because everyone's been remotely based and forced to come up with new ways to collaborate, is exciting, especially as the world figures out how best to come out of this pandemic. Many of those best practices and insights will stay with the global advocacy community. When it comes to political will, one of the challenges that the world faces has been a concerted attack to discredit the science that's helping us both understand the gravity of the climate crisis, as well as how best to inform the solutions that we need to have an impact. As you know, because of course you've been in these rooms, the IPCC 1.5 degree report, which was issued at the end of 2018, has been blocked for the last 2 years at COP24 and COP25. March for Science and Youngo have partnered to launch the Science Not Silence campaign in partnership with the independent state of Samoa and the Alliance of Small Island States. At the moment, there are about 15 governments have come on board supporting this initiative. we're optimistic that several more will follow in the weeks to come. Can you talk about the significance of this report being finally and formally welcomed at COP26?
Well, of course, there is a lot of talks around the IPCC way of issuing reports. Unfortunately, some of the other scientists themselves question how the IPCC work. But what is very much appear for me and for a lot of people that, and even the IPCC realized that if the scientists are in an isolated island without communicating with public, then their science will not reach as much possible people as we want. So IPCC created something called communicating science, where they actually train scientists on how to communicate with others and how to, bring the very complicated scientific theories to a very simple concept that the public can understand. And I think this is a very good step forward. Well, the 1.5 report is something, it's a very important document, especially as I mentioned earlier for African continent. And it's very important to explain to others what does welcoming the report means. So when the COP or when in a negotiation we welcome a document or a report, that means that inside of the negotiation we can always rely on the document that we already welcomed, and it can be like a reference for us in the negotiation. And just imagine, Matt, that the parties welcome the 1.5 report, and it means that as a negotiator, every time I walk into a room, I can clearly say and mention, well, according to the IPCC 1.5 report, we cannot accept this text and we should accept the other text. And then the Secretariat and the other parties will be also obliged to, yeah, we cannot accept it because clearly it's against the 1.5 report. And it's a very powerful tool, and I have big doubts it will be adopted in COP26, to be honest. If it happened, you are all invited to coffee and cakes.
Get that coffee ready, Nisreen, because I'm optimistic. I feel like that's coming. You know, it's especially looking at considering the role of the Trump administration and really discrediting that and leveraging its political capital to block it. It's of course they weren't alone, but I think the change in guard with the American delegation provides a huge boost towards that end. So I'm optimistic, but I hear you.
Yeah.
Others are claiming and requiring an English tea with an English cake instead of the coffee. So yeah, English cake and tea it is.
Love it. I love it.
Yeah. No, absolutely, Nisreen. I mean, I have so many more questions to ask you. I could keep talking to you all day. But unfortunately, we have to wind up. We have a series of very exciting events lined up for the audience. But thank you so much for being here with us, Nisreen. It was definitely eye-opening, including for myself, despite being to the negotiations for so many years. So I hope our audience found it useful. And we look forward to your conversation with your colleagues from the Youth Advisory Group and a few others now.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nisreen.
Thank you.
Bye.